Welcome to this month's MediaJustice Salon hosted by the Media Action Grassroots Network, also known as Magnet. Today's salon is entitled Shot on Camera, Documenting the Police. MediaJustice Salons are interactive spaces where members and allies of Magnet can connect, learn, and take action on top-line media and communications issues that affect communities at the margins. My name is Angela, and I'm the membership organizer here at Magnet. And as a membership organizer, I lead the network's education programming and convenings and work to grow our network. Magnet, for those of you who may not know, is a project of the Center for Media Justice, and we represent nearly 100 social justice, media, arts, and culture organizations from all around the country. Together, we are working to advance a people-centered media justice agenda, and as a national network, we amplify local grassroots voices, ensuring the on-the-ground expertise of our members influence media policy debates. To learn more about our network or to sign up your organization to become a member, please make sure to visit us at magnet.org. So let's go ahead and dive in. Our host for today's salon is Erin Ammons. Erin, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you to the Urbana-Champaign Independent Media Center for sharing their space with us today so that Erin can join us live on camera. Erin, how about you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yes, it is my pleasure to be here today. I am a co-founder of the Champaign-Urbana Citizens for Peace and Justice, a Magnet member organization, and I've been organizing here in Illinois for 15 years. I currently serve as an Urbana City Council member and as president of SEIU Local 73, Chapter 119. My wife and I host a community radio show called Higher Ground on WEFT.org. We are on every other Saturday from 8 to 10 a.m., and we've been doing that for about 10 years, using community media to push and win dozens of policy battles. And I'm honored to help host this conversation.
Thank you so much, Erin. We do want to make sure we share some logistics about the webinar with the folks who have joined us. Many folks have asked if we have a recording of this. We will have a recording, and we will make sure to share that out with everyone on our website. We also want to invite all of you to join us on Twitter using the hashtag #ShotOnCamera and hashtag MediaJustice, so you can share your comments, your thoughts, your questions while we're having this webinar. During the actual conversation, we will be holding attendee questions and comments until the very end. But however, you can submit a question at any point. In order to do so, just make sure you're logged on to the webinar through your computer. All you would need to do is open up that control panel you see on the right-hand side and just type in your question into the questions box. And we'll make sure to let you know when your question will be shared with our guest speakers. Today we have three amazing guests. You see them now on camera. We will be having them help us explore the use of cameras by community organizers and law enforcement as a tool to document interactions between police and community members. But before we start that conversation, we want to make sure we share a little bit with you about each of our experts. So we'll start with Nicole. Nicole Carty is a senior campaigner at Some of Us, a watchdog organization bent on curbing corporate power. Before joining Some of Us, Nicole was at the other 98%, where she served as programming director. And Nicole is also a founding member of the Crown Heights Tenant Union, an organization uniting new and old residents of Crown Heights together to fight gentrification. We also have with us Priscilla Neri, a Brazilian journalist and activist who joined Witness in 2008 and is currently overseeing the organization's work in Latin America, including the project on using video to fight police violence in Brazil. Before that, Priscilla helped lead Witness's global campaign on forced evictions, which supported advocacy campaigns in 5 different countries. Her work at Witness has been featured on the New York Times, Al Jazeera, and other outlets. And finally, we have Harlan Yu, who is a principal at Upturn, based out of Washington, D.C. Upturn works alongside social justice leaders to shape the impact of new technologies on people's lives. Recently, Harlan has been working closely with major civil rights organizations to examine law enforcement's use of body-worn cameras and other emerging police technologies. So thank you to each of you for being with us today, and I'm going to go ahead and pass it on to Erin to start the conversation.
Well, thanks, Angela. And first, I wanted to share a little background for today's call. and why it is so timely and important. This month's Salon is being hosted at a critical moment. We are experiencing tensions between cameras pointed at the police and those pointing at the public, and are having to face the implications these situations have on free speech, community organizing, and our community safety. So we have to ask ourselves, who has the right to record? Video is increasingly being relied upon by law enforcement agencies and the public to document interactions with police. Devices like body-worn cameras and dash cams on patrol cars have been adopted by every major police department under the pretext of transparency and accountability. On the flip side, more and more organizers and activists are using video as a tool to document and expose police brutality in their own communities. Also, social media now provides a way to broadcast those images in real time, like we saw with the murder of Philando Castile and Korean Gaines. In both instances, however, Facebook temporarily shut down those videos. With all of that happening, we see that recent court decisions have thrown into question whether the public even has a First Amendment right to record the police. Today, we invite you to listen to our invited guests and to throw in your thoughts and questions on the issue. Together, let's examine how video is changing the way we organize, the way we are policed, and the way our stories are being heard on corporate-owned platforms like Facebook. So, all right, we're going to begin today. The question that we're going to start with is, who actually has the right to record? So earlier this year, a federal judge in Philadelphia ruled that recording police, like many of us do when we see the police in our community, may not necessarily be protected under the First Amendment. While other judges have ruled that we do have a right to record the police, it's still a disturbing development. So Priscilla, I'd like to start with you, if you will, from Witness. Can you tell us more about some of the history behind the right to record in the U.S.?
Sure. Well, let me start by just noting that I am not a lawyer, but I have a lot of lawyer friends, and what they tell me is that, you know, there's still an overwhelmingly established right to record here in the U.S., even despite the recent ruling in Philadelphia. It's a constitutional right covered under the First Amendment, which then, by definition, overrides any state or federal laws that would prohibit such recording. We're also seeing, I mean, there are some restrictions. You obviously can't interfere with police activity. You have to be in a public space. There's some considerations around audio. So if you are recording audio, state level wiretapping laws may apply. Some states require both parties to consent. Some states require just one party to consent. But in general, if you're a citizen in a public space and you see a uniformed police officer, you have an established right to record under the First Amendment. And there are great resources out there by groups like ACLU and many others that really spell that out for you. We're also seeing a growing conversation internationally around the importance of establishing and protecting this right. And it couldn't come at a more important moment, right? We're seeing the role that this video can have in public conversation, in public action and mobilization. And I think it's our duty to, you know, talk about this being our right to film and film back. Police can't delete your videos, they can't confiscate your equipment, they can't ask you to see anything on your phone without a warrant. They also can't prohibit you from filming. They can ask you at the most to maybe step a little bit farther away, but they cannot prevent you from filming. And just knowing this is really important.
Right. At least not legally. Because, you know, we've had situations here in Champaign-Urbana or Urbana-Champaign where we had a couple of individuals, Patrick Thompson and Martell Miller, who were videotaping police interactions, and their video cameras and the tapes were confiscated illegally. And so we had a big case around that even here in Illinois, a couple of activists who were just simply trying to document what was happening and what they were hearing from the African-American youth in our community. So what have you seen, Priscilla, as far as organizers' experience regarding censorship issues, and why is the use of video so beneficial for organizers?
Yeah, I mean, I think when we see this big public discussion around body cams, right, and police wearing more cameras, you know, we've seen that it can have success and it can be well implemented in some places, but in general, we feel that that's not the perspective that's missing from the conversation. In general, I know what the police perspective is going to be. Without even reading the police report, I can bet they're going to say it was in self-defense. I can bet they were going to say they were attacked first. Bad police that commit human rights violations are afraid of cameras because they know that that's the only thing that can undeniably and irrefutably expose their lies. So this doesn't apply to all police. It applies to police who commit crimes and police who commit human rights violations. So what we really want to put the focus on is how do we as citizens fill in this gap. And it's not that the communities at the front lines of this violence, they've known this for decades. Whether we're in the United States or in Brazil, you hear for decades. Ta-Nehisi Coates says this phrase, which I love, which is, the violence isn't new, the cameras are new. So all of a sudden, this narrative that we've heard from these communities for decades now becomes undeniable because we have the pictures. So the challenge now is how we help people who have the courage to pull out their phones in a moment like that, that's so risky, so dangerous, and really make that video matter. How do they do it more safely? How do they do it more effectively? How do they do it more ethically? How do they protect their materials so that this could be useful as evidence? How do they think about whether they're going to put it online or not, and how to do that more strategically and more effectively and more safely?
Well, you bring up a good point. I actually was talking to a gentleman last night who said that there's a growing narrative that says that basically the computers that we walk around with right now in some ways are seen as a threat to national security, because what we can do in a handheld computer now, they used to have to warehouse and have to put all that information in a big warehouse, and you have access to it at the tip of your fingers. So Harlan, why don't you bring in the use of the video by law enforcement? Specifically, we know that there's been a dramatic deployment of body cameras to law enforcement across the country. We're told that they're being warned to increase police accountability, but what are some of the consequences to moving so quickly with this?
Yeah, I just want to start by echoing, Aaron, what you said at the beginning. I mean, this webinar comes at such a critical time, not just highlighted by the killing of Keith Lamont Scott in Charlotte earlier this week. In that particular case, the officer apparently was not wearing the cameras. As I understand it, Charlotte police, every officer has been assigned a camera, so it's unclear why this officer wasn't wearing one, but apparently other officers who were on the scene were. So there's a major question here about, who sees the footage that was recorded, if it exists. And there's certainly concerns about a new North Carolina law that goes into effect October 1st that severely restricts the release of footage without a court order. But to the broader issue, police-operated cameras are obviously no substitute for members of the community to record the police, right? As Priscilla said, we have that First Amendment right, and in so many cases that we've seen over the past couple of years, the video documentation of police violence has come from community recordings and not from body-worn cameras. Body-worn cameras aren't a panacea. They won't automatically hold the police accountable. It's the communities that are going to hold the police accountable, and it's going to be a long process. But I do think that cameras, in some cases, if implemented properly, can play a catalytic role by shedding light on violent police interactions that would otherwise be hidden, unseen, and go unnoticed by the public. And so in the process of building out camera programs, more often than not, the problem is that communities aren't invited into that policymaking process about how cameras are deployed into their communities, right? There are major questions about when cameras are turned on and off, and once a recording is in place, who can watch that footage and when. And these details play a huge role in determining what impacts cameras will eventually have on our communities. And from what we've seen so far, departments just aren't consulting with the community about what these policies should be. And that's a major problem.
From a policy standpoint, Harlan, I'm an alderman in the city of Urbana, and our police department is saying to us that they don't have the ability or the money to store all of the footage. What would be a response that we could have that would be an effective response to that sort of defense or roadblock?
Yeah, I mean, it is a complicated issue, and I do sympathize with police departments because departments are working together with vendors to roll out, to purchase and roll out these technologies. And it is really expensive. The main expense comes not from purchasing the cameras, but the ongoing storage cost of retaining that footage and having it available when officers, say they need to see it. And so there's a careful trade-off and balance here between retaining the footage long enough such that we can get accountability, but at the same time, deleting routine footage that doesn't have any accountability value after some amount of time. The other fear in our communities is that body-worn cameras will just turn into another tool for police surveillance, right? Imagine thousands and thousands of hours over months or years being stored by the police department about our public movements. With improvements in technology like facial recognition, it certainly becomes possible that this treasure trove of footage could be mined in the future to our detriment. So there's a careful balance between storing it enough to have accountability, but at the same time deleting that in due time such that the surveillance potential is minimized.
Okay. Well, thanks a lot, man. And I really wanted to, I'm sort of piggybacking off of what you said about the release of videos, and I wanted to bring Nicole into this conversation, especially dealing with social media now. So social media now provides a way to broadcast video footage in real time, like Corinne Gaines' final moments before being killed by the Baltimore police. In that horrifying instance, Facebook blocked her social media accounts at the request of police. What are the implications of platforms like Facebook shutting down the accounts of people documenting an interaction with the police? So Nicole, from some of us, has been working on a campaign with the Center for Media Justice, Color of Change, and others to get some answers from Facebook on why they shut down Corinne Gaines' account. So Nicole, can you share what you're hoping to accomplish with this campaign and why organizers should pay more attention?
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's a lot of reasons. Facebook is such an incredible tool for broadcasting information and sharing information about what the reality that activists are facing is. You're seeing it right now in Charlotte, and in live video. Facebook has created an incredible tool by letting people who are in the face of a police interaction or in the streets communicate directly with their networks, like the stories that are important to them. So obviously, when we saw Facebook step in and cut off Corinne Gaines' account, this to us read as a very dangerous precedent if Facebook was going to be intervening and shutting down streams at the request of the police. One thing we need to understand about Facebook now is that it's not just a platform, it's not just a social network. It actually is how people are getting their news. News isn't just happening and getting shared on Facebook, it's breaking on Facebook. So Facebook needs to have an intention with how it's pulling down content and how it's monitoring content, because what it actually is doing is controlling what the public sees and the public knows. So out of this campaign, we're really hoping for a few things. We want to, first of all, have Facebook let us know how it's making these decisions and be really transparent about that. Facebook has a number of policies about how it works with police and how it handles data, but as far as live video is concerned, it pretty much has nothing. And this is extremely concerning, especially when we're seeing cases like Philando Castile and Corinne Gaines and things in Charlotte, even as recently as last night, getting pulled down without any kind of understanding of why this happened. Another thing we're looking for is for Facebook to have an internal audit of its policies and its practices in how it's pulling down content that looks at it with an equity lens, not just Facebook will turn to having a set of community agreements, but what we don't really appreciate is that the community is nuanced and the public is not uniform. So it really needs to be quite intentional about what communities it's serving in pulling and the content that it's pulling down, and have some kind of intention around that. And the third thing that we're really looking for is having, even if its policies are better and improved, it needs to have some kind of public accountability mechanism so that people can hold Facebook to account in how it's making these decisions going forward.
Okay. Well, that's pretty clear, and I know we could dive a lot deeper into each one of those. So hopefully I'll get all three of you on my radio program, and we can dig a little bit deeper into some of these and some of the points that you're making with some of us. Um, when you look at this, Nicole, is it just from your experience, is it just the actions that people are seeing live that are feeding into Facebook cutting down these feeds, or do you think there's something else um, outside of the police involvement?
I think it's a couple of things. I think it's certainly actions, and when there are moments of large activity, there are a lot of streams that have mysteriously come down that were in the midst of a live broadcast that we really just want to, we deserve, the public deserves a clear answer about why these things are getting taken down. But there's also a ton of content that activists are putting out that is getting censored and getting pulled down from Facebook as well. We have a lot of questions around. So it is kind of the whole gambit of police interactions, actions in the streets, as well as activist content that Facebook really needs to have a sort of equity lens around.
Well, one of the things that we're seeing is that a lot of people are distrustful, especially older generations are distrustful of technology, right? And there's this thought that maybe, the Mark Zuckerbergs of the world are supposed to be these very liberal, or millennials are more liberal-minded folks, so it's kind of shocking to see something like this taking place on Facebook. So I just wanted to know from your perspective, Harlan, how reliable is footage captured on a body-worn camera, for instance? I'm wondering if you could speak to examples where the video and police report tell an official version that might not necessarily be true.
Yeah, I mean, this is a hugely important issue. I mean, it's really important for everyone to understand that camera recording are just one perspective. It doesn't necessarily tell the truth of what happened, even though it is a recording of the situation. So let me try to make this vivid with this story. So in Marion County in 2014, a man named Derek Price was being pursued by the police. There was body-worn camera footage of that incident, and what it showed was a contentious situation. So the camera was rolling, it was on the officer's body, and the camera was shaking heavily, and you could hear the officers on the footage saying, stop resisting, stop resisting, stop resisting. It seemed like obviously an aggressive situation. But it turns out that there was a surveillance camera mounted on a nearby building, which also captured the same incident, and it tells a completely different story. It shows Mr. Price giving himself up, lying on the ground, with 5 officers unnecessarily beating him over and over and over again. Now, those 5 officers were eventually fired. But the point of the story is that, a body camera can very easily deceive. It just shows one perspective, and it may give an inaccurate sense for what's actually happening. There's actually a really cool New York Times interactive feature from April that I would recommend people go look at. It's called, if you search in Google, you'll probably find it. It's called Police Body Cameras, What Do You See? And what it is it basically is a quiz where it shows you footage and asks you, how confident are you about what you're watching? What do you think you're seeing here? And I'm not going to ruin it for everyone, but, in one situation, you see a body cam footage showing, a close confrontation with another person. Camera's heavily shaking, just like in the footage from Marion County that I just mentioned. And the question to the reader is, how threatening do you think the situation is? And from watching the footage, and certainly from when I watched the footage, I think most people would say, well, that was, somewhat threatening to, maybe a very threatening situation for the person watching the camera. But again, there was an alternate view. And what it shows is a 2-person dance party. They were literally dancing in a parking garage. And they're just rocking out. I mean, to be honest, the dancing was terrible. But the point is that humans are really susceptible to confirmation bias, right? People see what they want to see in the footage. And, this is particularly concerning when we start having more and more body-worn camera footage being shown in courtrooms to judges and juries, right? The perspective matters, and we need to recognize it's just one perspective.
So, Priscilla, I wanted to get you in here also on this. So can you share the importance of community footage right now, specifically when it comes to how mainstream media covers issues?
Yeah. I mean, I just want to pick up on what Harlan was saying a little bit, because I think, you know, a piece of video, like he says, is just a piece of a puzzle. But the community perspective of that puzzle is one that we haven't seen as available, as documented now in the era of smartphones, where, you know, in the past you had to wait for a reporter to come to your community and tell that story, or a human rights researcher or a forensics expert. You know, you needed to wait for that, you know, credible stamp of this happened, you know. And now that we have our cell phones, you can kind of do that yourself as a citizen witness. Now, no one's born knowing how to be a witness. My 3-year-old knows how to film on the phone. That doesn't mean he knows how to capture the context that we would need in a situation like that, or to assess, for example, what is useful in a situation like that in terms of evidence. You know, at a protest, for example, it's very common where you see, if there's an officer beating a protester, you have 87 cell phones filming that same scene, and right next to him, you know, there's a commander who's giving that order, and that may be more valuable footage in terms of establishing the chain of command about who gave the order to. So when you think about, you know, the instinct to film, I think context is super important. It is just a piece of the puzzle, but when we think about historically about which narratives have been seen as credible or valid or official, what community footage is really doing right now is changing that conversation and presenting another side with evidence that really can't be denied. And this is giving truth to, again, what we've heard for decades and decades and decades from the communities and families of victims who have been historically on the front line of this kind of police violence everywhere in the world, really.
So tell me, all three of you will get a chance to chime in on this, but the question is, what tools and tactics is your organization or movement using to disrupt what is happening currently? So Harlan, for instance, can you share more about the body-worn camera police scorecard and share with us what this research has shown you in terms of gaps in policy in those cities that might be getting it right?
Yeah, absolutely. So we started this work early last year, 2015. So in May of 2015, my organization, Upturn, we helped to craft a set of body-worn camera principles that were signed and endorsed by 34 media rights, social justice, and civil rights organizations across the country, including many magnet groups that may be on the call here. And, you know, what the principles pointed out was that, you know, while many of the groups who signed on to the principles didn't necessarily see body-worn cameras as a useful or effective reform, there was a recognition that it's happening, and we needed to speak out about what the rules of the road for police-operated cameras had to be. So we published this set of principles for the use of body-worn cameras in May of 2015. And once we had the principles, the question in front of us was, well, what are major police departments actually doing, right? Are they actually following these principles? So over the next 6 months, together with a leadership conference on civil and human rights based here in DC, we developed the body-worn camera scorecard. And so if folks who are watching want to take a look at it, it's at BWC, which stands for Body-Worn Cameras, scorecard.org. And what we did was we scoured public sources to find all of the policies, body-worn camera policies that major police departments across the country have adopted. And we scored each of those policies on 8 criteria that were based on the civil rights principles. The goal of the scorecard is to provide a resource to help local advocates like yourselves to better understand what local policies are like and how they compare to other policies in police departments across the country to push your local departments forward. The other goal of the project was to name and shame police departments who have policies that obstruct transparency and accountability. And if you look at the scorecard, picture story is that no department has a perfect policy. Every department has room for improvement, and there are certain key issue areas with the adoption of body-worn cameras that are most concerning and where things look most bleak across the country. And I'm just going to go through 3 very briefly. One is on officer pre-report viewing. And what this means is when and whether an officer is allowed to watch the footage in the process of completing the official police report of that incident. The concern here is that if officers are allowed to watch the footage while completing their reports, they'll skew and conform their report of the incident just to what the body-worn camera shows, rather than an independent recollection of what the officer experienced. The second issue is access to footage, right? Obviously, cameras are adopted for accountability and transparency. And right now, in most departments across the country, in most communities across the country, even if there's a recorded incident and you're the subject of the recording, you have no right to access that footage because it's controlled by the police, and that's problematic. And finally, just the third issue that I find most concerning is the issue of facial recognition. Taser, which is the largest manufacturer of police body-worn cameras in the United States, has publicly stated that they plan to build facial recognition technologies in together with body-worn camera footage. And there are some police departments that are limiting their ability to do that kind of surveillance, but most departments across the country have not prohibited that capability yet.
So, Nicole, you want to respond to this? So the question is basically, what tools and tactics is your organization or movement using to disrupt what is currently happening?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one thing I mentioned earlier is we really want Facebook to take this seriously. So a tool we're really pushing them to use is an internal audit, because we can tell Facebook your policies aren't good enough, but to have someone who actually is used to looking at organizations and how their policies are playing out with an equity lens is a much more powerful tool than we can possibly do ourselves, right? And so really encouraging Facebook to understand it is more than just a platform. It is actually, in a sense, a media company and controls the narrative. That is something that we are very bent on. We're also using we have planned a live stream using the tools of Facebook to kind of talk about how Facebook's control of this media is really influential to people's understanding. And so that's one thing we're going to be doing in the future. We're also doing mass mobilization, really getting people to speak out and like publicly use social actions to encourage Facebook on Facebook to better its policies and have a better relationship with how it's pulling down content and collaborating with the police and governments, because this is clearly problematic behavior and Facebook needs to be held to account.
So Priscilla, can you just sort of briefly outline for us a couple of tools or trainings that Witness is leading, and more specifically, what are you currently doing here in the U.S.?
Sure, I'll start with the U.S. bit. So one of the things we're doing is collaborating with local groups and networks that are trying to use video to defend human rights more broadly, but also specifically on the issue of police accountability. For example, we have a whole curriculum that's called Video for Evidence, which is based on international experiences and also U.S. experience about how you as an activist can think about using video for the collection of evidence. How to do that safely, how to do that securely. So we partnered, for example, with a group called St. Louis First Responders out of Missouri. They're a branch from We Cop Watch, and they were interested in adapting these resources for the trainings they're leading with community people in the area that are doing first response citizen filming of the police. So for example, when there's a police shooting or something like that, we know that the first couple of hours after that shooting are extremely crucial, because that's when evidence may be tampered with or stories may be changed. So how can the community show up in that moment and be prepared with video to really protect that evidence and gather all the perspectives that are needed. So that's one example of what we did. We wrote about that on our blog. We're also recognizing that it's not just activists that are using video. Nowadays it can be an accidental witness, it could be a lawyer, it could be my mother, anyone. So we're trying to really think about how to make these resources more available to a wider range of people, not just the traditional core activist community. And we have a library of resources. These are free, like one-page tip sheets and resources in many languages that people can download, they can adapt, and use on things like how to film the police, what are your rights to film the police, how to think about a shot list, how to think through safety and security, how to think about the ethical concerns for the people you're filming as well. And we really learn so much from all the partners and collaborations we do internationally, and everything we learn goes back into these materials. So it's kind of like an ongoing feedback loop of learnings and tips that are relevant really cross-country if you look at the issues and the people that are the victims of this kind of structural violence.
So then what is the call to action right now for you all? Priscilla, it sounds pretty clear that you guys are doing a lot of education around and training, as well as showing people how the community can get involved. What rights do people need to remember they have when documenting? And what can social justice organizers do to protect themselves when video recording? I'm going to let Priscilla answer that.
Sure. Well, a couple of things. First thing is know your rights. So be prepared to know what to say if a police officer gives you an illegal order to stop filming, for example. The second thing is safety. So think about the safety. Try to work in teams.
Question. Let me interrupt there, because we've heard this a lot. Know your rights. What happens, or what do you suggest to people when they assert their right and then basically that right is ignored?
Yeah. It's a complicated question. There's not a right or wrong answer to it, Aaron. What I will say is that it needs to be really thought through, and preferably thought through with the team that's going to be by your side, right? So I would really encourage folks that are going to go out to do this kind of filming to think about, okay, what do we do if this? What do we do if that? Yes, we can assert our rights, but there may be instances when that's not the smartest thing to do. So, you know, my partners in Brazil, they laugh in my face when I say, you know, respond saying you have the right to film, because there is a legitimate risk that they will get shot or tortured or, you know, worse. So it really depends on the specific context, but this should be thought through. It should be talked through. You should have a little card that everyone carries around in their wallet with emergency phone numbers. You should have a network that you're ready to activate if you get arrested or if you need immediate support. And this is all something that can be talked about in advance. Also, know your purpose, right? So like I said in the beginning, are you filming anything that happens, or are you looking to film particular things that will reinforce, for example, a legal case or an advocacy campaign? So be strategic, know what to film, split yourselves. One person's going to film details. The other person's just going to keep a wide angle. The other person's going to get testimonies so that you have a diversity of documentation. Be ethical with the people you're filming as well. We know that video, like any tool, could be used for good or could be used for bad. So the same live streaming that you're doing to protect activists could be used to criminalize activists and persecute activists. So how do you think about the ethics of those that are appearing in the video? How do you give them an option to show their identities or not? And how do you think that through with your responsibility as, you know, obviously not causing further harm? And then lastly, be strategic after you film. So we have a knee-jerk reaction of, you know, the world needs to see this and we want to share it right away. That might not be the best idea. There are many cases that have shown if you've, you know, taken a breath and held on to that footage, it could be more strategic to release it, for example, after the police report comes out, which is what happened in the Walter Scott case. And then just the last thing is protect your footage. Try to archive it. You know, take care of your memory cards. Have safe copies. Really think about that preservation.
So, Harlan, what can communities do to have a stronger voice over the use of devices like body-worn cameras by the local police department?
Yeah, I mean, first thing is understand the issue. On body-worn cameras, I would suggest, you know, look at the scorecard. Look for your local department and see how the department fares. You know, once you you know, look at the scorecard and see how your department fares, I would say, you know, engage with the local department and with city council staffers on these issues. You know, the good news is that there are some major police departments that are taking community engagement seriously. New York Police Department, you know, the largest department in the country, recently had a public engagement session in all of July to take questionnaires and comments from the public about their proposed body-worn camera policies. Other places too, like in Philadelphia next month, There's going to be a city council hearing on the body-worn camera policies there. And so I would like to make an ask and also an offer to everyone watching here, to let me know when you hear of hearings and council meetings and other feedback processes that might be available in your communities when it comes to body-worn camera policies, because we have the capacity to help. But it actually is pretty difficult for us to keep tabs on, all of the communities that are on our scorecard. And so please get in touch with us when you hear of those communities. We're happy to help and to provide guidance and advice on pushing back on some of the worst practices that we're seeing across the country.
Well, I will definitely be in touch with you, Harlan, because we need to get some of that information for the city of Urbana. That's Harlan from Upturn. Nicole from Some of Us. How can folks on the call get involved and learn more about holding Facebook accountable?
Absolutely. So one way you can do that is by going to our website. We have a campaign up that people can sign on to that is asking Facebook to be transparent about what its policies are, especially with the respect to live video and taking down content and collaborating with the police. We're also going to be collaborating with a bunch of, we already created a broad coalition of organizations who are trying to turn up the public pressure on Facebook from key constituencies to say this is important to my community, it's important that we understand how you're collaborating with the police and what your policies are with respect to our personal content. So it really is just public pressure, and also if you do have and are part of like a key constituency and a key advocacy group, emailing me at nicole@someofus.org and getting onto our sign-on letter, because we're going to be trying to build that public pressure for Facebook.
And what is the website again, Nicole?
So you can just go to someofus.org. That's our website. And you'll see our campaign there.
That's SUMOFUS.org, correct?
Yes, exactly.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm going to let Angela take it from here and see if we have some callers on who have sent in questions or something. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Aaron. Wow, this has been an amazing conversation. It's been fantastic to hear from all of you, and clearly just full of resources and information, and we will make sure to pass this along to our listeners. This is a great time, I think, to open it up for folks. We have been receiving comments and questions, so we don't want to keep any more time away from them being able to get a chance to ask their questions for you. For those who are still with us, definitely make sure to type in your question into your control panel, and we will continue to pass the questions on to Aaron, and we'll ask as many of them as we can. If we bring you on to speak, just make sure you stay brief so that we can give everybody a chance to ask a question. Aaron, it looks like we have a question from Cindy, and we are going to try to bring her on live to ask it.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for taking my question. Can you guys all hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Well, I'm here in North Dakota, and the fight here against no DAPL. The police have been arresting anyone, including journalists, or I should say specifically non-mainstream journalists like Unicorn Riot, Censored News, Democracy Now!, that are filming either the cops or company misconduct. And in tandem with this, Facebook and Twitter are taking down people's posts, closing accounts, censoring posts and memes, and stopping live streams at exactly the moment when cops are coming in riot gear to arrest folks. So my question is a compound question. One, as non-mainstream media who are not being targeted by the police, even when they are on sites with non-traditional media, how do we fight these multiple layers of silencing and content both by police and on the internet? Thank you.
Well, let's go with Priscilla first.
Yeah, it's sadly something we hear a lot. I would encourage you to do basic things like set up your automatic backup on a cloud service so that even when the live stream is interrupted, what you recorded till that point, you have a copy of somewhere. Obviously, traveling with extra or using extra memory cards and things like that you can in the moment preserve. I've been following a little bit the situation there, and I know it's super complicated in terms of, I wish I had a magic formula for you. But, apart from coordinating the coverage between what we've seen, something that works really well is coordinating between the different non-mainstream outlets that are covering, so that you have different vantage points covered and one can back the other up if one is destroyed or interrupted. Obviously, a network that you can activate that will immediately replicate those SOS calls when the live stream goes off, and what can you do that brings in all the remote networks that are following and that care about this issue to take action in a moment like that. I don't know if my colleagues have any other ideas.
Nicole, Harlan, let's go with Nicole and see what you got for us.
Yeah, I would just say that this is exactly why campaigns to hold organizations and companies like Facebook accountable are so important, right? Like, the effects of content are far-reaching, and they do not, they reach every single issue area, every single activist organization, or anything that could be understood as controversial. And so I would really think about who are your amplifiers on social media that can actually direct attention to Facebook in a way that they'll reach. Organizations like CMJ have relationships with Facebook, and pursuing those channels to bring to Facebook's attention, hey, this was really important, you cut off this live stream, what happened, just so that they are feeling a bit of the pressure is a super important strategy.
Harlan, what about you?
Yeah, I agree with both Priscilla and Nicole. I think they covered the question well. Redundancy, making sure if rights are violated, still want to be safe, obviously, but making sure it gets documented somewhere by someone, and raising the issue and making sure in the future that doesn't happen again.
Well, I just wanted to say one of the points that you made, Priscilla, about saving the document or saving the video and airing it after the quote-unquote official story has been shared. So one of the things that we do here is that we use the public access channel also, right? So if you get something documented and you have it up to the point that they interrupted the live stream, now you can come back and use maybe those public access channels to show the other version. And whatever happened to YouTube, Nicole? Nobody uses YouTube anymore?
People still use YouTube. YouTube is still great. So Facebook is sometimes preferable because it's plugged directly into the social medias. But yeah, YouTube is great. There are also sites that aren't on YouTube or on Facebook. Livestream was a service we used a lot when we were doing actions in New York. So there are certainly alternatives.
Okay, all right. Angela, do we have another call?
We do. We have a question from Sam. If we can bring Sam on.
Hi there. My name is Sam Mayfield. I'm calling in from Idaho, and I am wondering if you can speak to laws changing from state to state or city to city regarding filming the police and our right to continue to film once they tell us that we need to step back, or yeah, basically, that's the question.
Okay. How about you, Harlan? Why don't you take that one?
I think that's probably a question better suited for Nicole. I'm neither a lawyer nor one that knows the specifics of state-to-state policies on recording. Priscilla, do you want to field that one?
Priscilla
ACLU.
Lawyer friends.
I would say look at ACLU. That's what I would do.
You said call the ACLU?
The ACLU has generally good resources at the state level about what state law says in each particular example. So I would do that. National Lawyers Guild also has some good resources. Cop Watch, I don't know if they get as granular as specific state laws, but definitely ACLU or the National Lawyers Guild would be places to start to find that.
Well, one of the things that we learned here in the case that we had, it's called an eavesdropping case. It was eavesdropping in Illinois is the way they termed it. And there was a distinction that had to be made between video footage and audio footage, right? The eavesdropping component was when you pick up the audio unexpectedly. So I do think people need to look at the laws from state to state and distinguish what the differences are there. But in particular, we had an officer who was being filmed and telling the individuals who was filming him that he was not going to arrest them because, after all, the news, every average, everyday citizens, as well as the police department, they video people and they pick up audio and video footage. So Harlan, I was kind of throwing that question at you because of the duality of that. I mean, both sides are actually videotaping and picking up audio. And what are the laws, or not the laws, I know you're not a lawyer, but what are some of the distinctions that you've learned through this process?
Yeah, I mean, there are major state-to-state variations, certainly in the governance of body-worn cameras. You know, state legislatures are setting, you know, statewide policies that the police departments in those states need to follow. Sometimes they're good in the sense that it takes discretion away from police departments in, you know, the release of footage. In other cases, police unions are getting a part of the legislative process and being there and lobbying for, you know, requirements that are really friendly to police, that stops local police departments from implementing even better rules because the state law requires them to do something else. So, you know, that's extremely active. You know, almost all of the state legislatures have already passed body-worn camera laws or are considering new laws because there are these tricky balances between, you know, transparency and privacy. And so it's important for us advocates to engage in that process to make sure bad laws don't get passed.
Well, we definitely see where more local organizations are starting to see, just like in Illinois, we have something called the American Legislative Exchange Commission, who are is a big, rich Republicans basically who are attacking and going after state government to try to get particular policies passed. We have to take some of these fights to the state level and the political fight at the state legislative level. So Angela, I know we're getting close to the end of time here. Did we have one more call, or are we wrapping up?
We have one more question from Savannah. If we can bring her on.
Hi, this is Savannah. I'm calling from New Orleans. And so one question I have is there's been so much of a push for body cameras in, you know, a lot of the progressive media, and people realize that it's a stopgap measure, like Harlan was saying. But all these body camera programs dump hundreds of thousands of dollars into police budgets, and we're trying to shrink those budgets. So I'm wondering if there's alternate ways that we can leverage the interest in body cameras into some kind of community-controlled programming or other means to put more eyes on the police while still working to defund those departments.
You know, just really quickly before you guys dive in, we were thinking here, when the police officers were approaching and proposing tasers, that they give up an item off their quote-unquote tool belt as opposed to just adding another one. So it didn't save any money, but it was, you know, it was somewhat along the lines of what Savannah's talking about as far as defunding and addressing this militarization at the same time. So Nicole, why don't you take that one to start off?
Sure. I think that's a very good point. I mean, I think that something about a lot of the reforms that are being asked of policing kind of are counterintuitive in that they are inflating the budgets of these police departments, right? And I think we have seen that police cameras can be used for good and for ill as well. And so there certainly is a lot more area there to like toss out. I think that your suggestion, Aaron, was actually really smart to think about, okay, how are we keeping our eye on the prize? But we're actually trying to do with these police departments and shrink them while instituting increased measures of accountability along the way. And I think that's a really good stopgap solution. I'm just going to lift up what you said because I think that was pretty smart.
All right, thank you. Priscilla?
Yeah, I love the question and the idea, really, because I think that that's the path that we should be trying to highlight, right? Like the police departments themselves, some of them are like, you know, we're just doing this because this is what people want to fund us to do. You know, there's so much media pressure for this. It's covered so much. Like, we don't necessarily think it's the best idea, well, obviously for different reasons, but I think the more we can push for the community control aspect and the other non-militarized approaches and community-controlled approaches to policing, I think we'd be on a better track. So I love the question and I love the idea. And I love the body on camera scorecard. Thank you, Harlan, for working on it. I wanted to get that in somewhere.
So Harlan, we're going to let you get a shot at that last question.
Yeah, totally true. Body-worn cameras are extremely expensive. I think this is why, as part of the scorecard, one of the criteria that we look at is limiting the retention of footage. You know, you imagine that an officer is walking his or her beat for 8 or 9 hours a day. That's a lot of storage, and the vast majority of that footage is really not interesting, right? It's really mundane, doesn't have any accountability value, there's no evidentiary value. That stuff should just be deleted pretty quickly after the event, right? 90 days, 180 days, there's no reason to keep that around. That will lower the cost of these programs. At the same time, I totally agree that, you know, departments are under tremendous pressure to adopt cameras. If they don't, they get seen, at least in the media, as being cagey and not trying to be accountable for their actions. So there is pressure to do it, and it is a high cost. There isn't as much competition in the vendor market as there probably ought to be, which means that vendors can really charge a lot of money for a lot of this cloud storage. And so, yeah, it's a careful balance that we need to strike. But, you know, if departments are going to buy cameras and spend this money, communities should at least get accountability. The problem is right now they're both spending the money and we're not getting accountability, and that's just not good.
Well, I want to thank all three of you for your time, your sacrifice, your energy, and all of that. And as my mentor used to tell me all the time, stay at it. Angela, you going to take it?
Thank you, Aaron.
Thanks, Aaron.
Thank you,
This is
Harlan.
fantastic, all of you. Thank you to everybody again for joining us today on this Salon. Definitely a big thank you to Aaron and Michael, who was helping them out with tech, and our folks out at UC Independent Media Center for hosting us. Hey, Michael. So as a reminder, a recording of the webinar will be available on the website in the next few weeks. We do want to encourage folks, when you log off of this webinar, you will receive a short survey in your browser window to evaluate our webinar today. Please take a few minutes just to fill it out. We definitely always want to improve the process of our webinar, so your feedback is very critical. Make sure to join us for our upcoming learning opportunity happening on October 26th at 1 p.m. Eastern. We'll be talking about grassroots fundraising. This webinar will be free to Magnet members and a nominal fee of $35 for non-members. And lastly, Magnet is a grassroots-powered organization that relies on the contributions of people like you. So please make sure you consider making a donation to Magnet online at mag-net.org. Everybody have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you, Angela.